Buonasera a tutti e benvenuti su Liberi Oltre per un'altra puntata di approfondimento su il tema dell'Ucraina e in questo caso su quella che è un po' l'identità storica, politica e culturale di questo paese. Mentre attendiamo l'arrivo del nostro ospite, che è Oleksii Sokyrko, colgo l'occasione per presentarlo. Oleksii è uno storico ed è professore alla Facoltà di Storia dell'Università Taras Shevchenko di Kyiv. Il suo campo di specializzazione è la storia dell'Ucraina e dell'Europa orientale tra del XVII e XVIII secolo, in particolare l'aspetto militare. Ci raggiunge però per parlare di qualcosa di abbastanza diverso e che ha a che fare con un articolo scritto da lui nel 2011, pubblicato su il settimanale di Ukrainian Week, su il pericolo di falsi miti e falsi narrative riguardanti l'Ucraina, la sua storia e la sua identità. Sottolineo che questo articolo fu pubblicato nel 2011, quindi questo era prima di Euromaidan, prima della rivoluzione della dignità, prima dell'annessione della Crimea o dell'inizio della guerra nel Donbass, quindi in tempi, diciamo, non sospetti. Ed è un articolo particolarmente interessante per come preannuncia alcuni degli elementi e dei temi principali che hanno a che fare con le origini della guerra che vediamo oggi. Vedo che Oleksii ci ha raggiunto. Hello.
Hello, nice to see you.
Here.
Ludovico, nice to see you. Good evening.
Nice to see you. Thank you so much for being with us. We're really delighted to have you. Thank you for coming, for making time for us. I've done a little short intro in Italian for our audience, introducing you and your work. As I mentioned, as a historian, your field is mostly the history of the 17th and 18th century in Ukraine and Eastern Europe, especially the military history. You wrote a book or a series of books on the Battle of Poltava, for example, which is an incredibly important episode in the history of Ukraine. And as much as I think we would all like to talk about that, the reason why we're here tonight, the historical circumstances have kind of forced us to focus on something else you wrote more than 10 years ago. And that was an article that was published on the Ukrainian Week. And the title was False Narratives on Ukraine Can Be Fatal for European Security. And I just want to give a bit of context to the audience before we go into the article with you. What I want to stress first is that this article was published in 2011. So this was like long before, the beginning of any war in Ukraine and between Ukraine and Russia. It was before Euromaidan and Revolution of Dignity. And that's what makes it so prescient about the future in a way. And the underlying idea is that, there's often a cliche about we never learn from history, whereas what actually your article suggests is we just learn things that are wrong, and that's where the real threat is. And what you're saying, basically, you identify a series of myths about Ukraine, about Ukrainian history, about Ukrainian identity and culture, and argue that if this myth become widespread, not just among the public, but among decision makers, political elites, and cultural elites in Europe, this will lead to a crisis and a threat to European security. Now, I'll hand it over to you in a moment, but just before that, I wanted to list those myths for our audience so that then we can kind of dissect them one by one. The first one is the one about the 1,000 years of shared history. So the notion that Russia and Ukraine have been the same country for 1,000 years, they're brotherly nations, and so on. That's the first myth. The second myth is that the victory or the prevalence of democracy in independent Ukraine is a tool or can be a first step towards a spreading of democracy in Russia. And then the third one is that Ukraine is safe from a violent scenario. The idea of a war between Russia and Ukraine is just not realistic. Again, I stress this was written in 2011. No one would say that today, but in 2011 that was not a popular or a particularly widespread opinion. So let's start from the first one about the shared, the 1,000 years of shared history. Help us understand why, as you say, Western Europe has its own mental map of Europe, and until and Ukraine and Russia are the same color in that map, and that is because of the way that Western Europe understand the ancient history of these two countries, and of how Russia privatized, as you say, the history of Kievan Rus. Help us understand what Kievan Rus was in very broad terms, and why that misunderstanding is so important to all of this.
Thank you so much. First of all, I would like to thank you for inviting to this conversation, the present meeting. And I must say that I'm a historian, and I will try to explain these matters through the prism of the past, of the history, of course. So, how Russia privatized the ancient history of Rus into its imperialist all-Russian ideology? It's a rather important question, and I think that this ideological privatization of old Rus history, or history of Kievan Rus, began in the 15th, 16th centuries and took place regardless of Ukraine. It was then that the Moscow princes and later Moscow Tsars included in their title the word Rus, and because Muscovite grand princes and Muscovite Tsars they had Rurik dynasty roots. They declared that their right to inherit ancient Russia. Of course, gradually these epithets increased, and the claims of the Moscow rulers extended not only to the political borders of Rus, but also to the territories that received Christianity after the baptism of Prince Vladimir in the 10th century. Thus, these were the territories that at that time were part of Polish, Moldavian, and Hungarian kingdoms and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. It's worth recalling that most of these lands were part of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and joined this Grand Duchy in voluntary to protect themselves from the rule of the Golden Horde. In the Grand Duchy, the Rus Orthodox and Catholic nobility felt well and even shaped the idea of creating a Grand Duchy of Rus, united in a person union with Lithuania and Poland. However, Moscow's ambitions were constantly growing, especially during the 16th and 17th centuries, when there were frequent wars with Lithuania and Poland. In reality, they competed for leadership in the region, but formally Moscow waged wars under the slogan of uniting all Rus, all Russian lands under its rule. This tendency intensified in the 17th century when Moscow taking advantage of the Great Cossack Revolution and the creation of autonomous state here. And Moscow was able to bind it to the Treaty of Pereyaslav in 1654. This was a clear victory for the Moscow Tsars, of course. They captured the ancient capital of Old Rus, Kyiv. It's interesting, by the way, that since then some Russian monarchs, have twice planned to move their capital to Kyiv. The first time during the reign of Muscovite Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich, and the second under the Russian Emperor Alexander II. This was of the great symbolic significance because Kyiv was capital of Old Rus. Kyiv was the capital of Orthodox Church and so-called the second Jerusalem for Orthodox peoples. However, the rate of claims of the Russian heritage increased significantly when the Moscow Empire proclaimed itself as the Russian Empire in 1721. The ideological program of Peter I, Peter the Great, finally consolidated the epithet Rus, equivalent Russian, in relation to the state and geographical area and its main people. And this ideology were produced during the 19th century, consisted of three tribes, three peoples of Russian Empire, or Great Russia. Russians, as in narrow sense, as the main people, Little Russians or Ukrainians, and Belarusians. In the 19th century, when the formation of the modern Russian nation and its identity took place, this picture became its basis. In later exists with some changes in the Soviet era and somewhat updated for existing Russia today. In the pre-modern period up to the 19th century, the identity of the present ancestors of Ukrainians was also called Rus. It was largely associated with the ancient Kievan Rus political and Orthodox heritage, and was carried by local princely families, Ostrovsky, Vishnevetsky, Koretsky, Chetvertinsky, and some others. About 10 great princely families were the main owners of the Rus heritage, concentrating power and property in their hands. The idea of Rus, which is based on the descendants of princes, was one of the political myths for the Ukrainian nobility in the 16th, during the 16th and 17th centuries. When the Cossack state, Cossack Hetmanate, emerged on part of the Rus territories, its elite, Cossack Starshina, also justified its rights to power by its service to old Rus princes and the protection of the Orthodox Church. But when in the 19th century, modern Ukrainian identity began to take shape, and it turned out that its ancient name, Rus, Russia, was already appropriated by imperial ideology and reserved only for the ethnic Russian culture. Therefore, Ukrainian intellectuals were creating a new historical myth for their people, chose a different name, no less ancient, because the first mentions in historical sources of Ukraine is in the 12th century, but different from Rus, Russia. So they must change it, this native name Rus into Ukrainian. Similar, it's rather interesting that rather similar process of finding one's name took place in the Belarusian national movement during the 19th century, where some creators of the early modern national idea proposed to call the people and territory of present-day Belarus as Litva and Litvins. But those who opted for Belarus or White Russia won. By the way, now among Belarusian intellectuals, especially after the brutal repression of the dictatorial regime of Lukashenko, are continuing some debates about a return to Litvin as a self-titled formula has resumed in order to distance itself from the Belarusian formula, which is identified with the imperial Soviet colonial status of Belarusians, which is now burdened by cooperation with Putin's Russia. So that's my my answer to your question in brief, of course. Sorry, Ludovica, you are switched.
As usual, I had muted myself in order to not to have any echo. I just wanted to say a couple of things to help our audience understand. So essentially, the name Rus was the name of a medieval Viking state.
Yes.
It derives from Scandinavian language, possibly Finnish, actually, or ancient Finnish. So it's not even a Slavic word. It has nothing to do in its origin with what today we call Russia or Slavic territories. Apparently its etymology is to do with rowing or something like that, because Vikings were obviously navigators and merchants. And warriors, of course, as we all know. And this word Rus was then only, and Kievan Rus disappeared around the 13th century. So only several centuries later, the princes of Muscovy took the Greek version of the ancient word Rus, which was written Rossiya, and privatize it, adopt it as the name of their own state, which from being a principate, a grand duchy, had in the meantime evolved to being a much larger state, which had expanded to Siberia and will then reach, the Pacific Ocean and then Central Asia, and only finally the West, which is quite fascinating. I think a lot of people wouldn't remember that aspect, that until 17th century, it's essentially an Asian empire that only frequently becomes a European one. So this kind of helps us understand. I think what's interesting is how the version, like the Moscovian and Russian version of this story, of history, has become the widespread version in the West. Like, I'm sure that most people in the West, in Western Europe, have an understanding of it that is much closer to the Russian narrative. Why do you think that's the case?
It seems to me that the West audience sees, first of all, the picture that Russia is trying to impose on it, which has always had an initiative in this self-presentation. And it seems to me that this self-presentation has always been very dynamic and pretended to be real. In the 20th century, for example, it was instrumentalized at various levels, from cultural diplomacy to propaganda to the involvement of Western politicians and cultural figures who had left-wing, pro-communist or right-wing political views, or sympathizers of Russian culture. And that is why strategy was very effectively continued by the Soviet Union and Russian Federation at the present moment.
And so in that direction is also the myth of the brotherly nations, which keeps being repeated. The interesting thing about the myth of the brotherly nations is that it is not just an imperialist Russian myth. It's very often repeated in Western Europe by people with very good intentions who say, oh, this war between Russia and Ukraine is absurd because these two people are brothers. This is not last President Macron said something like that. And it's quite, can you help us understand why this notion is so twisted and inaccurate?
It's a very broad question, and I will try to mark some institutional and cultural differences between Ukraine and Russia, in brief, of course.
Yeah, that'd be helpful.
So I will try to cite some of the main institutional differences that I see at different stages of history as historian, of course. And the first difference is the presence in the Ukrainian historical tradition of institutions of civil government. It's very important point. Self-government, urban, there are cities with Magdeburg law. The self-governing institutions of the elite were very strong. Boyars, gentry, Shlachta, and later Cossacks. The ancestors of Ukrainians lived in states with elected rulers. Kings and hetmans in Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and in the Cossack Hetmanate were election rulers. And the law upheld basic civil liberties. Yes, in 16th, 17th, and 18th century, mostly for elite, but already in the era of democratic revolutions during the 19th century, this historical tradition called for its spread to all citizens. Secondly, it's a very high level of legal awareness of various segments of the population, primarily elites. For example, Lithuanian statutes in the 16th century were the first codex of civil law in continental Europe, with a very modern interpretation of individual rights. This is a very wide network of courts and a general habit of invoking the law and resolving the conflict. The Russian Empire curtailed and reformatted the station in the direction of increasing the role of the monarch, Tsar and later emperor, and his administration. The court and administration in Russia were not separated until the end of the 19th century. The third, it's a priority for Ukrainians to own private property. During the 19th century, this mental trait developed by previous historical realities and was a good ground for the emergence of the middle class. However, the Russian Empire blocked the development of this community, and not only in Ukrainian lands, by the way, because it saw it's a political threat to the autocracy. In addition, as the experience of Europe in the 19th century, the middle class became the bearer of the national idea, and this was also dangerous for the Russian Empire. And the fourth, this is an inclusive model of culture and later of national identity also developed historically. I mean, Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian identity. As the ancestors of Ukrainians did not live in isolation and ethnic migrations always took place in his territory, productive algorithms of the coexistence of different ethnic groups, cultures, and religions were gradually developed. Of course, this is didn't save from conflicts and sometimes very acute. For example, persecution of some groups of the Orthodox, of Protestants, or Jewish pogroms during the Cossack uprising of the 17th century. But in the long run, the confrontation was replaced by peaceful coexistence and mutual exchange of experience, culture, and survival strategies. That's very interesting. In my observation, this experience was especially strengthened during the periods of external pressure and threat. For example, when the Russian Empire did this with its colonial policy towards Ukrainian, Poles, and Jews. Either the repression of the Soviet regime with its deportations of Crimean Tatars or the extermination of Ukrainians by artificial starvation, thus there was a backlash between opposite peoples and cultures, and they understood each other better and united to survive. And now we still see this inclusiveness and empathy of Ukrainians and Ukrainian culture model.
In a way, I think actually this is really very interesting, and in a way it could be connected to the broader consideration that most of what today is Ukraine, of the Ukrainian territory, experienced the same history that the rest of Central and Western Europe experienced for most of its history. They lived the invasion of the Mongols, and then the Renaissance, Reformation, Counter-Reformation, Enlightenment. So there was actually, if one wanted to look backwards, one could see centuries of shared history with Europe until a certain point. And it kind of leads into the second myth, because in your second myth, you basically saying that it's a mistake and it's wishful thinking to look at Ukraine, and this is back in 2011. So Ukraine has been at this point an independent country for 20 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it has had democratic elections. To this days in Ukraine, no incumbent president has ever been re-elected. So there's always been a very vibrant political change and political scene. And what you're arguing basically is that the democratization of Ukraine should be seen as a goal in itself, or since you were saying this in 2011, should have been seen as a goal in itself, and not just as a part or a first step towards a wider democratization of Russia. And the reason why what you argue is you can only believe in their wishful thinking if you think that these are the same country, and these are the same people, and these are the same tradition. But that's not what you argue, is that this is not the case. And actually, that a democratization of Ukraine could possibly and potentially lead to even more authoritarian regimes and a more authoritarian reaction in Russia. Can you help us understand this dynamic? Because I think it's not 100% appreciated in Western Europe, and definitely in Italy.
Yes, so you see, there are some important points. First, the democratic national movement in Ukraine has not always been self-sufficient. Ukrainian politics of the early 20th century formed during the imperial policy of assimilation. And that is why often they didn't see themselves and Ukraine outside of multinational Russia. But bitter disappointment, really bitter disappointment, came during the events of the 1917 revolution in Russian Empire, when Ukrainians were denied their own subjectivity by both communist Russian politicians and Russian Democrats. Both the Reds and the Whites Russians saw in Ukrainians only the little Russian and little Russians as an integral part of the big Russian world and united and indivisible Russia. Something similar happened at the end of the Soviet Empire. For a long time, the Russian democratic opposition viewed Ukrainian democratic parties not simply as allies, but as co-founders of the new Russian state. A new Russian state without communists and as Russian Democrats like Boris Yeltsin saw the future in a single country, but without communists, without communist regime. Many Ukrainian politicians did not think about it. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1981, the situation of the early 20th century was repeated. Only then did the gradual enlightenment of both sides begin. Secondly, and it's very important for a historical point of view, that Russian democracy had never had its own bright examples in its historical past. There were no accident because due to historical specifics of the Middle Ages and early modern times in Russia, there were no democratic institutions, or at least their prototypes. In the Ukrainian historical tradition, such patterns were and were included in the national historical myth in the 19th century and have often been and are appealed to in political programs of the parties in the 19th and 20th centuries. In order for Russian democracy to abandon the view of Russians and Ukrainians as one people, it needs to completely reconsider its own identity and its historical foundations. It seems to me this is very difficult, and in the existential sense, maybe it's perhaps it's very terrible task for the nation and its intellectuals. And now, but now I'm not sure that there are communities in Russia today that can take the step. But but you see, historical baggage is not the final diagnosis for the nation and cannot be a verdict. As a historian, it's difficult for me to offer recipes for the present day. But as a citizen, I believe that building democracy is a homework task that each nation does on its own, and above all, based on an inner awareness of democratic values. And Western democracies can help us institutionally, but ideologically and mentally, value-wise, we are on the path to freedom ourselves. And I think the current war for freedom in Ukraine is a proof of that. That's my answer.
Thank you. No, that's incredibly interesting, and it kind of, like, once again, I think it goes back to that very beautiful sentence you wrote in the article, which is, in Western European mental map of Europe, Ukraine and Russia have the same color, and you could actually reverse that. That at the time, in the 1990s, what you're talking about, and so on, for many Russians, Democrats, that was the same. They didn't see, they saw themselves, the democratic process in Ukraine, as a part of a wider democratic process in the Soviet space. They didn't have this perception of the national differences and of the different experiences. Do you think that, and I know this is a tricky and difficult question, but do you think that this idea of the mental map of the two countries being of the same color, I think that for whoever still held that idea until the 24th of February, I think that idea might be gone. Like we might have got rid of that myth. Would you agree on that? At least on the Western European side.
I don't know exactly, and I haven't some strict answer to this question because first of all, I'm a historian. I deal with some processes which had finished, but now the war in Ukraine, it's current events, and I don't know. Maybe the best audience, the best democracies, they will to reform its point of view and perspective, to see the place of Russian culture, Russian civilization in European history and in the European presence, and we will see.
And from here, I would like to move into the third myth that you list in the article, which is, again, it's odd almost to read it today, because what you state, that the third myth is that Ukraine is safe from violent scenarios, meaning Ukraine is, the myth is that there will never be a war between Ukraine and Russia. Of course, it's absurd to even say that today, but again, we have to remember this was in 2011. So in a way, can you help us understand what was it that back in 2011 made you say that? Like, what were the trends and the events of what was happening at the time that made you think, actually, this is a war between Russia and Ukraine, violence between Russia and Ukraine is actually a likely scenario?
First of all, I think the main reason for the present war is the reincarnation of Russian imperialism. Another attempt to exercise its right to dominance, and in addition, it's generated by the desire for revenge and kind of insult of the West, which rejected Russia and its desire to join the civilized world. To a large extent, this resentment and motivate Russia to take revenge on Ukraine, whose path to open society and democracy countries. But this is only part of of course, it's only part of motivation of Russians, dictated by what happened after 1991. Their deeper motivation is determined by the same as in Soviet imperial times, the belief in their own messianism in relation to neighboring countries and cultures. If you share this, or if you adopt this messianism, then you are with us and are part of us. I mean Russian world, yes? If not, then you are enemies. And that is direct reasons of case of war for mostly Russian people now.
And in a way, wouldn't you say that on the Western side, because you describe very well what's the mindset, at the root of this war of invasion, of this war of aggression of Russia against Ukraine, which started 8 years ago. We're just now seeing a more intense and escalated phase of that war. But on the Western side, instead, on the European side, I always stress Western European because I always have the perception that in Central Eastern Europe and in the Baltics, people have a better understanding of the dynamic between Russia and Ukraine. That's why I keep saying Western Europe, and I should say probably Southern Europe as well. But anyway, the reason why there was such a myth, such an understanding, was that, again, if in your mental map Russia and Ukraine have the same color, if Ukrainians are just little Russians, I wanted that to be in quote, of course. If they are brotherly nation, if you buy into this myth of the brotherly nation, there can't be a war, because it's just unthinkable. So in a way, it's almost as if the third myth kind of derives from the first. It derives from this lack of understanding of the separate history of these of two countries and two people and two different cultures and identities.
I would like to emphasize just one point in this context about myth of brotherly nation. Yes, this myth is a part of Russian imperial narrative, And the explanation is that the Russian imperialist myth is essentially now restored in Russia. And this is a slightly updated version of it, previously formed in the 19th century. You see the civilizational heritage of the Russian culture. It's a claim to the longevity of power in a particular area, cultural heritage, Christianity in its Orthodox version. It's all of these units of Russian civilization myth are closely connected with old Rus heritage. And that is why if we remove these blocks from Russian historical myths, there will be nothing left in it. And it seems to me it's a very important thread for present Russian ideology.
Thank you. And that kind of leads into the final part, like the final part of what I wanted to ask you, which has to do with something you mentioned towards the end of your article, and is also like the background image of it, which is a painting. And it's a painting by a Soviet Russian painter, Ilya Glazunov, who painted this eternal Russia. I've used it as the icon for this video as well. I will share my screen.
I'm sorry, Ludovica. Did you show to our audience this picture with?
It was the preview of the video.
Okay.
So I will share it now so people know what we're talking about, because it's much easier if people are aware of what I'm referencing. One moment, let me share my screen. Okay, I think we should see it. Right. So this is the painting by Ilya Glazunov, and it's called Eternal Russia. And it can you help us understand what this painting is, what its history is, and what does it represent?
Yes, the first in the first rank of this picture, we see old Russian princes. For example, Saint Volodymyr, which baptized old Russian patriarchs, emperors, tsars, and communist leaders, prominent Russians, poets, artists, composers such as Fyodor Dostoevsky, Lev Tolstoy, Pyotr Tchaikovsky, and so on and so on. And at the background of the picture, there are prominent architectural architectural
if
buildings.
You don't mind, I'll try to magnify it so it becomes bigger. You keep going. In the meantime, I'll just get a larger version of it, so it's easier for our audience to understand. You should see much bigger now. Is that correct? Good.
At the background of picture, there are many architectural symbols of Russian culture. For example, Orthodox cathedrals and churches, Muscovite Kremlin, monuments of Russian emperors, for example, Peter the First, and so on. It makes of some old Russian, medieval, early modern, imperial, and communist, and nowadays historical realities. And it looks like very eclectical, but it seems to me that it's shows the eclectical mental map of nowadays Russian ideology.
Yeah, what's very fascinating about this is that it kind of merges ancient medieval history of a time when Russia, didn't even exist, with people from history you couldn't really argue they were Russians, with people of actual Russian Empire and of the Soviet Union, in a sort of trying to establish this of thousands of years of continuity. This painting dates back to the 1980s, if I'm correct.
Mm-hmm.
Is that right?
Yes.
And we know that Putin himself to be a huge fan of Glazunow's work, which
Yes.
One would wonder why, right? It's actually, I mean, if one looks, I mean, this is possibly the most famous one, but there are a series of paintings that I really recommend the audience, if they have time, to, when they have the chance, to go and look at them. Because if you want to understand the ideology behind this war, and behind this imperial mindset, if you want to understand it with the images, all you have to do is really have a look at a few of these paintings, and you understand the mindset behind it. There is another one that is very significant, that is called it's called the contribution of the people of the USSR to world culture and civilization. And in this painting, which again I can show, we see I'm showing the wrong one. We can see basically 1,000 years. I mean, you can help me describe it, but there are figures that have nothing to do with the Soviet Union, of course, but they're all presented as Soviet people, the contribution of the people of the USSR.
You see, it seems to me that there are some difference between some sophisticated ideological myths and popular mentality and popular myth among rank Russian peoples. And this is a great cultural problem to describe and analyze present Russians' mass ideology, which formed by Russian government propaganda. And but now we can see how ordinary Russians live and work, not burdened by complex worldwide and education. This is the vast majority of Russians who not only support the war against Ukraine, but support the total destruction of the neighboring people and their culture. And these are ordinary soldiers, natives of the ordinary Russian people, who commit and crimes against Ukrainian because they are different and don't want to be like Russians. And I think that is exactly the phenomenon that was discovered by the war. And its understanding should be key to understanding what is happening to the Russians and what may happen next. But sorry, this is beyond my competence as a historian.
Yeah, I won't try and have you predict the future. I'll try not to do that. Look, thank you so much. I think we still have a few minutes. So if having kind of dissected these myths, having looked into even at their visual representation in Glazunov works, what was your if you're happy to talk about it, this article that you wrote back in 2011 was recently republished for obvious reasons, and rereading it, what was your how did you look at it? What was your reaction to it, reading it again today?
It's very hard to read this article for me now, because I see that some of my reflections about threat and of Ukrainian state and Ukrainian policy now realized, unfortunately. That it's rather hard. It's rather hard to understand that some mental structures, some ideological things lead to war now. And I repeat, I'm a historian first of all. And I analyze first of all the past. By the way, I'm especially interested in military history of early modern Europe and Ukraine, and unfortunately now I see the same things, the same troubles of war, which were in 17th in wars of 17th or 18th centuries. It's and it's very very hard and very painful to see it at the present day. Yes, and in my country, these victims, troubles of war. Of course, I'm not painter, and but I think this tragedy of war, it will be presented in maybe in some Ukrainian artworks, films, cinema, pictures, or music. Will be seen.
Thank you so much, Oleksii. I was really happy to have you, and thank you so much for making time for us. And I want to send you, from all of us, our solidarity in these days.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we will continue to speak about this, because I think it's crucial. We're inundated with information about what's happening today and every day in Ukraine, on the front, in the cities. And it's very important that we all, that we all pay attention to that. But I think it's equally important sometimes for us to spend time looking at the past and try to understand how we got here. Because if we don't figure that out, if we don't understand that dynamic, we can't really understand the present. And I'm really grateful that you came and spent some time for us trying to help us understand that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, and bye.
Do pobачення, goodbye.
До побачення.